Some of y'all know Gospel of Matthew is sort of one of my things. But I've tended to hit it. We've never preached through the whole book. We did a deep dive and went through the Sermon on the Mount and then just left it at that. And some of you guys have been in discipleship classes with me, and I have a whole curriculum that I've written and teach on discipleship from the Gospel of Matthew, where we kind of, I would say, speed read. It's 28 chapters, and we do it in about 15 talks, so we're hauling. I am going there. So I was just trying to decide where to go next. You know, we've hit a bunch of different things in the fall. I wanted to get us into a book. We've done some Old Testament. I wanted to do some, we've done some epistles. We haven't been in the Gospels in a while, and I think that's kind of important. You got a sheet? That's where we're going today. The coloring sheets match. I do make coloring sheets every week, and now that the baby's letting us sleep 4 hours, they're back. So Gospel of Matthew is where we're at in our 6-year Bible reading plan. Some of you guys know we do a 6-year loop, and we're on year 1. We just started again. And so Genesis and Matthew is what we're reading right now, because the way it works is you read the Old Testament and the New Testament at the same time, and you begin and end every month in the Psalms. So from a context of worship, we read the whole Bible and see the revelation of Jesus. And so I'm sitting here and I'm looking through the Bible reading plan, and I'm realizing y'all, because of that back and forth, are going to be reading from Matthew till like September. And I might be able to preach through the whole gospel by September. And because I've taught it in a big picture, I thought it would be really nice to slow down and actually work through Matthew's gospel. So yes, we will talk about discipleship a ton. That's my passion. Our church was birthed from that burden and from what we would call the Matthew model of discipleship. But I want to dive in and let you really chew on the themes passage by passage. So we won't just talk discipleship. We're going to look at the whole of it. So Matthew's gospel, let me see if I can kind of walk you through some of this. We've got 28 chapters. So if I teach a 15-week discipleship course, obviously we're not covering even every chapter. And some of those chapters are like 50-plus verses, where you've got like a story and a whole sermon right in one chapter. And then, so I want us to see this. So this week I just want to sort of introduce the book to you, and then we'll start in chapter 1, and I'll preach the genealogy to you. And that's one that we just tend to run through a little quicker. So Matthew's gospel, how do you look at it? First off, I want to introduce the main characters you're going to run into as we walk through this gospel. Every gospel has sort of its own focus. Matthew does focus on Jesus' kingdom and how he builds it through discipleship. So obviously Jesus is going to be a big character, and we're going to talk about him and how Matthew reveals Jesus in the first couple chapters, and so that'll be the big theme of today. But the other players, as you read through Matthew, and if you're doing the 6-year Bible reading plan, just listen to this. He's got these groups that he uses. One is the disciples, and Matthew tends to use the word disciple to refer to just the 12 that were called. So that's 12 little dudes around a cross, because they all follow Jesus. I know it's small, and you're like, oh, is that what that was? He looked like Star Wars Imperial symbol or something. Not the dark side. The 12. And so like Luke uses disciple about anybody who listens to Jesus for about 5 minutes. He calls them disciples. So disciples come and go. Jesus has hundreds of disciples in Luke, because anybody who listens is a disciple in Luke. But Matthew wants to see this unique thing Jesus is doing with the 12. And so he'll pull them aside more. He'll zoom in on them more. So look for the disciples or the 12. That little title is going to crop up, and as we set the stage for different scenes, it's Jesus, the 12, and then these two other groups that show up a ton. One is the people or the crowds. Remember Luke, anyone who listens is a disciple. Matthew has the disciples and the crowds. And there's these dueling conversations. The crowds wondered, and the disciples asked. The crowds were confused, and then the disciples are getting more explanation. And so there's this interplay between the crowds and the disciples. And then the fourth group is the scribes and the Pharisees, and sometimes the chief priests and the elders. These get lumped together, and often Matthew will just list them all together as they speak in one voice. And so the scribes and the Pharisees and the elders were upset, and they asked. They all said at the same time, and it's like corporate responsive reading by Pharisees or something. Yeah, so they get treated as a group, and I think Matthew's doing that because he wants to reveal something about Jesus and Jesus' kingdom, and so he uses these as his main players in the way he tells the story. So as you read through, look for those groups and watch where they stand and who's asking what. And that'll help you even as you do your readings. Now, let's put the book together. 28 chapters, how does it flow? There's a couple different ways people look at the Gospel of Matthew. I would always encourage you, when you want to work through a book, look for how the book breaks itself up. And we talk about this. There's different phrases and ways the author gives you to understand what he's doing. Matthew's Gospel, alongside Mark's, would be some of the earlier ones. And they have a lot of marks of what we would call oral gospel, right? Because while these were written pretty early, we know they were preaching the gospel before the gospels were written, right? These stories were being told from day one. They go out and they talk about Jesus. Paul goes places, Peter goes places, and they tell the Jesus stories. And so we know we've got this oral tradition of sharing the message, and at some point they write it down. We think Mark, I would side with this view, that Mark's gospel is Peter's version. So Peter probably went and preached the Mark story a ton. Mark was Peter's assistant, and at some point Mark writes down Peter's version. Because Peter says, I want to write down an account. And he mentions that, and then we don't get Peter's account, we get Mark's, and we think that's because that is his version. So Matthew has his collection of stories. It's a piece of the story. And his one reads out more like something that would have been preached out loud. There's tons of sets of 3, which if you're preaching from memory, right, what do all the pastors do? I have 3 points. It's just a memory trick. And so when Matthew's stories tend to, if they summarize, they truncate it into 3 points. Or if they arrange it, it's sets of 3s and common themes. And you can see this is how you preach it out loud. And so it has those feels, and that gives us some nice structural cues. So one of the lines he uses that some folks would say breaks the book into 3 main chunks, and I think this is a good overview of Matthew's story, is from that time on, Jesus began to. Chapter 4:17, chapter 6:21, he has this line repeated verbatim. And right, in an oral retelling, you've got these lines that are sort of the chapter 2. So he has his intro, where he gives the backstory, and that's where we'll be today. And then he says, from that time, and we begin Jesus' ministry. And that's the green into the blue. And we get this season of Jesus preaching, calling disciples, doing miracles. And then there's this key juncture. From that time, Jesus sets his face towards Jerusalem. And we shift from this heavy walk with the disciples teaching ministry to Jesus is on his way to die. And it's to the cross, his suffering, his death, his resurrection, and the Great Commission. And so that breaks the book nicely into sort of 3 chunks. And I would say this isn't a bad picture of like the main flow of the book, right? So introduction, events prior to Jesus' public ministry, chapter 1 through roughly 4:16. You can debate that. Well, the lines are there, so that's why you draw there. Body of the story representing samplings of Jesus' teaching and miracles, climax, the suffering, death, resurrection of Jesus. But as we look through it, that's just 2 repeated lines. And that's a big book to break by just 2 repeated lines. There's another line he repeats more commonly, and so a lot of folks recommend breaking it into what they call 5 books. It's when Jesus finished. And what they notice is there's sort of a flow to the book. If you kind of take that there's an intro and an epilogue, there's a bit of storyline that doesn't follow this, but these in the middle, what you'll have is a bit of narrative where Jesus is doing stuff, and then a bigger teaching thing. There might have been little comments in the narrative, but then you get Matthew, more than any of the other authors, drops these teaching bombs where we get a big chunk of Jesus' sermon. And then at the end of the big teachings, he'll say, when Jesus finished, and then it segues to another narrative. And so some folks have said that's probably a better way of feeling the flow, is you've got these 5 stories, if you will, that are the main organizing way that Matthew's remembering and retelling who Jesus is he's going, well, here's the thing, Jesus, we went here, did this, and boom, here's some teaching. And then we went here and we did this, and each of the narratives sets up a context for the teaching. So is it 3 books or 5 books, or is the 5 books 7 books? How are we supposed to read Matthew? These aren't exclusive. I think he can have a big overarching way that he remembers and tells the whole story of Jesus. And then within that, obviously, he can't possibly tell everything Jesus did. So which stories do we tell as we walk through the overarching story? And he's got, well, here's my here's my top 5, tell you about Jesus. So I would say we put them together. And this will take a sec because my animations are loaded. But to say we've got an overarching 3-fold break, and then we've got a 5-fold within that main unit. So here, I was going to zoom in. So the prologue would be the infancy narrative, chapters 1 and 2. Get Jesus born and give his pedigree. And then book 1, we get the kings and Herod and different folks responding, and the calling of the disciples climaxing up to Sermon on the Mount. Huge teaching, right? 5 to 7. That's 3 chapters of teaching. So you see how there's like a little narrative chunk, 2 chapters, big teaching. And then Jesus finishes, and that takes us over to book 2. Narrative, chapters 8 and 9, and at the end of 9, he sends out his disciples. And so we get this interplay with calling of disciples, some narrative about disciples, and then a teaching on what it means to be a disciple. Chapter 10 up to 11 when they get sent out. Books 3 and 4 then would be some narrative, chapter 11 through 12. And here we begin to have tension. Jesus is going places with disciples. There's a lot of questions. Why do your disciples do this? Why don't they do this? Scribes and Pharisees start fronting really big in this section. And then the teaching is parables. And this is so cool because early on it's about calling the disciples and you get plain teaching. Guys, this is the kingdom. You've heard, but I tell you. Now we start getting the fighting, and the scribes and Pharisees are really in it. And he's like, so here's a parable, and those with ears to hear, let them hear. And then he'll grab the disciples and they'll go in a house and they'll talk about it. And the scribes and Pharisees don't get it. And so we begin to see the tension between the ministry of Jesus and the people of unbelief, those who reject him. And so book 3 really begins that. Book 4 carries that forward. And really, who do men say that I am? What is Jesus doing? Book 4 is unique because it's where Matthew introduces the word church, which is an odd word to have show up in the Gospels, since church is usually what we see in the epistles and later in the New Testament. But Jesus talks about, I will build my church. And so the leading religious group in the previous narrative is not cool with Jesus, and we talk in parables. Now we start identifying Jesus and his people, and we start having teachings on church. So see the play. Then you move from book 4 to book 5. We get some narratives leading into the what's coming. There's this crisis. Jesus is going to die. He's going to be raised. He's pulling the disciples aside and giving them insight into this. And he begins warning, and we get what we call eschatology. That's normally we would say end times, but any times you have sort of this kind of apocalyptic, man, it's going to be a rough moment, and you're thinking, what's the big picture? Where's this all going? What's my hope? That's eschatology. And so we're leading into his death. Narrative-wise, we see that tension building, and his teaching now begins to say, so what's it all about? Where are we going? And so that'll be some fun stuff. I typically skip those chapters in my discipleship class, so I'm really looking forward to us preaching through them and making a mess. And then the epilogue, the end of the story is what Jesus said happens. He does die, he is raised, and at the end of it he says, all authority in heaven and earth has been given to me. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations. So the end of Matthew's story, what's interesting is Jesus has not ascended back into heaven. He's still chilling on earth. And Matthew's like, okay, cool, good story, I'm done. So clearly his focus wasn't to tell the whole story of Jesus, because he kind of left off a cool ending. His focus was, when does Jesus get the authority in the kingdom? And when does he send his disciples out to make more disciples? So the beginning, we're going to establish who Jesus is. That's what we'll look at today. And we'll see him as the Messianic King and the fulfillment of the Old Testament prophecies. And so we know this is the king who comes to reign. And then by the end of the book, we see him saying, I have the authority. Through my death, through my resurrection, I have my authority. And now I'm building my kingdom through my disciples. And so it's an interesting sort of king, an interesting sort of kingdom. And this is why I didn't want to teach this as just a discipleship class, is when I do that, we zoom in heavily on just the disciple part, which is, this is putting it all together. So that would be 5 books in the 3-fold trajectories. That's my fancy chart. We'll keep rolling. We could hit on the Matthew model discipleship, and it will come up a ton as we go through here. But I think the main heart of Matthew is the kingdom of heaven is at hand. That the king is come, and Jesus' main message in Matthew when he summarizes it is, repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. And I think the kingdom of heaven is coming into our midst as people are transformed in the likeness of Jesus through Christian discipleship. So this is a big part of it, and we will flesh out some principles of biblical discipleship as we go here. But our main focus is that you see Jesus, the Messianic King, the fulfillment of the Old Testament, bringing the kingdom of heaven into our midst, building his kingdom, having that authority. So I've got these little icons. They're going to float in throughout our sermon series where Jesus gives us a sense of what a discipleship vision looks like. So we got a little telescope where he shows us what a discipleship culture should be. That's our big pack of people. Where he reveals what a discipleship culture is, what the character of a disciple, character should be. Because this really matters. I've talked to tons of folks who are like, I'm big on discipleship. And we have totally different targets on what we're trying to see produced in people. And I think Matthew's gospel lays that out pretty strong. And then also, how do we, measure and understand what discipleship is and success in a discipleship ministry? What is, and I put it in a bigger Matthew way, what is success in the kingdom? What matters to the kingdom? And so comparing to a discipleship standard. You might be successful in many people's eyes, but what does Jesus think? And so as we walk with Jesus through Matthew and we see the kingdom of heaven at hand, I think, yes, we'll talk discipleship, but we're going to talk kingdom. And we're going to see how Jesus, in his very flesh, is, right, God and man combined. Heaven is where God is. Earth is where man is. They were meant to be one. God hung with us in the garden at the beginning. Because of sin, God graciously separates himself lest we be destroyed. And yet in Jesus, here is heaven and earth joined. And so Jesus, God and man in one, shows up and says the kingdom of heaven is at hand. Repent. And then calls disciples. How does the kingdom come? It comes through Jesus and the discipleship of Jesus, bringing the kingdom into our midst. And so he preaches the kingdom and he teaches the kingdom. And we want to get that whole package. So as we go through Matthew, we're going to major on the kingdom of heaven. And we'll talk discipleship on the side. So that's our overview of the book. Boom. Coloring sheets match the PowerPoint. Who did the artwork? Thank you. You're like the best commercial I got, man. All right, so where do we start? So there's our little, and then all the little discipleship things fly out of it. I forgot I had an animation. All right, let me get us into Matthew. Matthew chapter 1. It's fun start. He opens and says, these are the generations. Let me see, I have it in here somewhere. The book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. That's the shortest genealogy I've ever seen. It's fun because in the Greek it's the Genesis of Jesus. Now pause here, right? Genesis, first book of the Old Testament. And one of the motifs that Matthew's going to front is that Jesus is the second Moses. Moses received this prophecy: there will be a prophet like you, greater. And then Moses says, you listen to him, wait for him. And Matthew will set up in his narratives when Jesus goes up on the mountain of transfiguration, this very much, he's in a Moses role. He's the greater Moses. Well, so he opens his book with this Genesis, the Genesis of Jesus, and then he orders his book into 5 sections, right? We said 5 books, and if you remember, the books of Moses are 5 books. Now, there's a lot of 5s in Scripture, and you could argue that might also just been a good way to remember stuff orally, but Matthew plays with this too much to just let that be an accident. So right out the gate, yes, it's a genealogy, but he's already talking theology. Who is Jesus? Well, the truncated genealogy is he's a lot like Moses, and he comes from Abraham, and he comes from David, which are 2 great covenant promises in the Old Testament. To Abraham, we have the covenant, to you and to your offspring, right? Through your seed will all nations be blessed. And Paul will later say in Romans, seed is not plural, seed is singular. There is a seed from Abraham we're waiting for, through whom all nations will be blessed. And so Matthew comes to the gate and says, here's the seed. Jesus is that seed. The blessing we've been waiting for is now. And the rest of his genealogy is going to back up that take. And then he says Jesus is the Messianic King because he's the son of David, the king who was given the promise that one from your lineage will rule on the throne forever. So we've been waiting for an eternal king, and we've been waiting for a global blessing seed And so he goes, here's the Genesis. What Genesis and the Pentateuch, the five books of the Old Testament, what the Torah looked forward to, boom, here he comes. Then we get his genealogy, and we need to look at it. And I know you're dying to just read through all these, so I ain't gonna. I'm gonna let Andrew Peterson read them to you. Have your Bibles open and follow along as he sings the Matthew Begats. 1 minute.
Abraham had Isaac, Isaac he had Jacob, Jacob he had Judah and his kin. Then Perez and Zerah came from Judah's woman Tamar. Perez he brought Hezron up, and then came Aram, then Amminadab, then Nahshon, who is then the dad of Salmon, who with Rahab fathered Boaz. Ruth she married Boaz, who had Obed, who had Jesse. Jesse he had David, who we know as king. David he had Solomon by dead Uriah's wife. Solomon, well you all know him, he had good old Rehoboam, followed by Abijah, who had Asa. Asa had Jehoshaphat, had Joram, had Uzziah, who had Jotham, then Ahaz, then Hezekiah. Followed by Manasseh, who had Amon, who was a man who was father of a good boy named Josiah. Who grandfather Joachim, who caused the Babylonian captivity because he was a liar. Then he had Shealtiel, who begat Zerubbabel, who had Abiud, who had Eliakim. Eliakim had Azar, who had Zadok, who had Achim. Achim was the father of Eliakim. He had Eleazar, who had Nathan, who had Jacob. Now listen very closely, I don't want to sing this twice. Jacob was the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, the mother of Christ.
It's only 2 minutes and 2 seconds, so it doesn't actually hurt the sermon time too bad to do it twice if we have to. And then here's Matthew's wrap-up. So we get the whole list roughly the way he's saying it. Obviously, he added a couple things, and he fixed a couple things that maybe you caught and we'll talk about. Verse 17, which is the last of our chunk, says, "So all the generations from Abraham to David were 14 generations. From David to the deportation to Babylon, 14 generations. And from the deportation to Babylon to the Christ, 14 generations." So that's Matthew's why did I go through all these names? Verse 17 is meant to be his explanation, and it's a weird explanation. The truth is, it's a weird genealogy. One, when we compare it with the Old Testament, they're not 14 generations. He skips people. There's 3 really wicked kings, he just jumps them. There's other wicked kings he leaves in. I mean, he's not afraid of bad guys. We got harlots, prostitutes, and people who cause you to go into Babylonian captivity included in the list. So he's not filtering for the good guys. And if you are familiar, Luke has a genealogy of Jesus, and the first half kind of matches, and the second half doesn't at all. And the numbers don't add up. If you count from the Babylonian captivity to Jesus, it's 12 or 13, depending how you count your people. And he said it's 14. So he says it's 14. It seems like it's 12 or 13, and then he says these are the generations, but they're not. They are, but they're not all of them. What are you doing, Matthew? This is a weird, confusing, and not very confidence-inspiring way to start a book. Well, one, Matthew's not American. Spoiler alert. He's not Roman. He's not Greek. Matthew's gospel is the most Jewish gospel. It is written, and it presumes that you know the Old Testament. There are what one commentator called Easter eggs in here for people who love the Old Testament. They would have read this and would say, well, it's not about a perfect list. It's not about getting every name in. That's our style, right? We're all about Ancestry.com. Got to fill in everything on my family tree. It's like bingo or something. And that's not how they're thinking, right? He didn't, because when he opened, if that's what he was thinking, what's with his first version of the genealogy, son of Abraham, son of David? That's clearly skipping things. So if we're like, I didn't expect him to skip stuff, did you read verse 1? He's giving us a list to teach us about who Jesus is. So I do believe these are all Jesus' ancestors. And he's picked them and organized how he tells it to talk about who Jesus is. He's introducing the prime character. And so that's why we don't want to just brush past this, because some of the stuff he's doing not to give us just, a birth certificate, but it's all theological, and it all points back to the Old Testament. So for instance, if you heard in verse 17, the way I would fix some of the numbering issues is he double counts some people. Sounds like he does just in the way he describes it, right? All the generations from Abraham to David is 14. But then it says David again. David to the deportation, and he doesn't mention the guy on the deportation. So if you bump him over and his son, and then do count Jesus as one of the generations, you get your 14s, even though you double counted, because you sorted it the way he wanted you to sort it. Because I don't think the 14s were about getting everybody, but sorting it in a theological way. I think the numbers mattered, the names mattered. So I want to walk through. And then the other thing, I guess, before I move off of this, so why this and Luke are different? If you read, man, there's a ton of different theories. Some will say Matthew's genealogy is Joseph's background, and that Luke's one is Mary's. Some will say that Matthew's genealogy is Mary's, and Luke's genealogy is Joseph's. That got confusing. Some will say the way you fix the numbers on this one is that Mary's dad was actually named Joseph, so she had a dad named Joseph and married a dude named Joseph. And so you count Joseph not as the husband of Mary, but as the father of Mary, and that bumps you another number in there and fixes your 14. Except for church tradition has never really thought Mary's dad's name was Joseph. We usually think it's Jehoiakim, which shows up as a variant of one of the names in Luke's version, and she still got issues, but it's doable. Then you throw in, like, lots of guys have theories about levirate marriage, because if you remember in the Old Testament, if a guy dies without children, one of his relatives will marry his wife and have kids to carry on his lineage. So you can sort of have a kid with two dads, because his biological father is his legal father's brother, who had him with his dad's wife to carry on the inheritance. And so when you write a genealogy, whose name do you put down as the kid's dad? And levirate marriage is part of the Old Testament law system. We know it happens. And we even are pretty sure it happens with a couple of the names in here. So you can really get the genealogies interesting. And so you could run down those roads, but this is where I'm going. Matthew doesn't seem to care to answer those questions. He felt like verse 17 was a sufficient answer. 14, 14, 14. David, exile, ta-da, Jesus. That's all he wants you to get. So I don't really know. I lean towards this is Joseph's genealogy more because Matthew seems to be interested in concerning Jesus' right to be the king, his legal right to be the line of David, and that would pass through Joseph. So yes, it's cool because he's born, Joseph's not biologically involved, but he's legally the dad. I think this is the legal record, and then I view Luke as the birth record. There's some great scholars on my side. There's some great scholars who think I'm nuts. There's some great early church writers who are with me, and there's some great early church writers who are not. It's not going to change who read the book. Here's the things I think he actually wants us to get. If you're reading it and you were listening as a Jewish person, here's some of the stuff I think would jump out. 1, the women. Did you catch there's a bunch of chick names in this genealogy, and that's not generally how we do the pedigrees in a Jewish genealogy. And we generally didn't pick great ladies, right? Tamar tricks her dad to sleep with her, father-in-law to sleep with her so she can have a kid. That's not a happy scenario. Rahab is a prostitute Canaanite who converts to Israel. And Ruth is a Moabite whose childless first marriage ends in death, and then she comes back. And she's got probably the best story of the whole group of ladies in here. David, it references that he has Solomon through dead Uriah's wife, right? Doesn't even give Bathsheba's name, because that's not a great scenario either, right? This is the guy he cheated with, the lady he cheated on her husband with and had her husband murdered. I don't know that she's super culpable in that, but it's still just a crappy scenario and doesn't make, like, of all the things we could share about David, that's the worst. That's what's in the genealogy. So what's he doing? Canaanites, Moabites, prostitutes, abused people, and moral failures. That's the genealogy Jesus comes from. Well, if this genealogy isn't about sharing everybody, but revealing Jesus' identity, then you got to say Jesus comes from and for broken people. We're going to see Jesus say that explicitly in just a few chapters. I came for the sick. I came for sinners, not the righteous. He could just as easily say, I came from sinners, not the righteous too. The grace of God that he can come through a broken lineage full of failures. And I'm not saying, you're saying, women are bad. No, but I'm saying in their culture, these were all the embarrassing parts of the story. And he ran a highlighter over them. And he includes them. Includes the captivity. So one feature, a Jewish person would go, what are you doing? You're deviating from how we normally do this, and you're doing so in the worst ways possible. It would have been glaring, and they would have said, Jesus comes from the broken people. And each of these were moments where we saw God's grace intervene, that even though we were broken, even though we were sinful, the promise still stood. God protects the line and carries it forward through his providence using broken people. And whether that's broken in the case of Ruth, where it's just that we see death ruining her life, right? Ruth's not at fault for that. Or broken like Rahab, where she's lived her whole life in sin, and faith grasps her from death and saves her. But all of this is we see the death and we see the sin and we see the grace. And he says Jesus comes from the grace line. This is who he is. The coming Messiah is the Messiah for broken, sinful people. From them and for them. So that's the first thing that's weird about the genealogy. And I would say Matthew's intentional, and this is why he organized it. Then the other one, I kind of smiled. If you were following with your Bible and you were reading like a more literal one, if you have like the ESV in front of you, Andrew Peterson, somebody else. Andrew Peterson corrects the spelling of two names. He said Asa, which is what we traditionally know him as, King Asa, not awesome guy. But the ESV says Asaph. And then Ammon, which the ESV says Amos. Now, both of those are uncommon but valid alternative spellings you could do in translating from Hebrew to Greek. And if that's all it was, cool, but those names are not like little unknown names to a Jewish person. Asaph is one of the writers of the Psalms. We see his name across the Psalms. Amos, prophet I've memorized more of than any of the others. Who is this Jesus? We start with the patriarchs. And though we don't understand who this Jacob and Joseph are at the end, it's interesting that the last couple names mirror patriarch names. And we opened the book with a reference to the Pentateuch. So we got the Torah, the law, and then we flip a couple name spellings to allude to the writings and poetry and the prophets. That's the basic makeup of how Jewish people view the Old Testament. They break it into these chunks. And Jesus' genealogy Easter egg nudges all the sections of the Old Testament. So who is this Jesus? He comes from the grace line, and he's the fulfillment of the Old Testament in its entirety. Johnny, what you got? Yeah, there's a ton of weird names in there, huh? That's why we sang it. So the allusions, this allusion to Asaph, this allusion to Amos, where he just deviates the spelling in ways that a Jewish person would have went, I see what you're doing. These aren't random, these aren't mistakes. This is the genealogy of Jesus. It's the list of names that tell us who he is. But then the one that Matthew highlights the biggest, we got to talk about, his sevens, right? 14 generations, 14 generations, 14 generations. What's with all that? Well, if you know anything about Old Testament folks and you know about the law and things, seven's a big deal, right? day of the Sabbath, seventh day of the week. And so 14 is 2 sevens. And the way he's broken it down, we have 6 sevens leading up to Jesus, which means Jesus, in Matthew's logic, is the beginning of the 7th seven. Now, what's with all that? I mean, aside from being cool math games, if 7 is this idea of fullness and completion, which it is, that's how the Jewish folks would have heard it, fullness and completion, 7. Then there's these storylines of Israel that are being completed. From Abraham to David, there's a completion here with his promise moving forward to the next stage of promise. And yet, it's not complete because, right, David sins, kills Uriah, and sleeps with his wife. 2 more sevens. We come to a completion of this broken monarchy season with the exile. 2 more sets of 7. We've now come to the very edge of completing the completions. 6 sevens. We're waiting for all these sad stories to come together and be wrapped up. And he says, and then Jesus. Jesus brings us into the final 7. I mean, that's the way they would have felt it. If these are all wrap-ups, to get 6 wrap-ups means we're in the home stretch. It's this idea that the whole story of Israel finds its completion in Jesus. What it's been waiting for, what it's been wrestling with, what it's been anticipating. Jesus begins the last chapter. And so we hear people say from time to time, man, do you think we're in the last days? To which I always say, yes, I think we've been in the last days since Jesus showed up. Because when he showed up, it's the last chapter. There's nothing else to the story. He comes, and when he returns, we're done. Because this is the last 7. And so Matthew takes the generations. I think that's why he plucks some people out and chucks them. He says, I want you to get this sense of a story progressing in sections wrapping up. And I want to line up the numbers so that when we get to Jesus, you see that we've entered the beginning of the end, the last 7. And when Jesus gets to his completion, it's all complete. The 7th 7, the 49, the Jubilee, the freedom that the Old Testament looked forward to is Jesus. It's the story of Jesus. He's about to tell the story of Jesus. And so he puts us on the cusp of the 7s. And he's, again, to a Jewish audience reading the Old Testament, the 14s wouldn't have been random. The 7s wouldn't have been, they'd have to go, why? And they'd been counting, and they would have seen, we're at 6, what's next? And he says, Jesus. So that's why I think Matthew's like, dun-da-da-da, 14, because he's expecting his audience to like get ready to clap at this point. This is the amen moment for them. Because if you're reading the Old Testament, you just saw the law, the prophets, and the writings, and the Torah points to Jesus. You saw the covenants, David and Abraham, points to Jesus. You saw the need for grace and a Savior, points to Jesus. And then he says, and add it all up, Jesus is going to answer this thing. So this is where we start. We want to know the kingdom of heaven. We want to watch what Jesus is doing. We need to come in through the genealogy with the same anticipation, and we need to see Jesus as Matthew identifies him. So what do we do with all this? We see Jesus as the Messianic King. He comes into a broken world for it, all of it. The inclusion of Canaanites, Moabites is a picture, because remember, so at the beginning, we get a genealogy of a Jesus who comes from not just Israel. And the end of the book is that Jesus says, go and make disciples of all nations. Jesus' heart is for the whole world. And so if we're going to come and see Jesus and respond to Jesus, we have to have a heart for all people. That the gospel goes to all, including broken, including messed up situations, including those who are doing the wrong or have been affected by the wrong and bondage to the wrong, suffering the effects, the death that comes from the wrong. The gospel comes to that. Everywhere you find it, the gospel has a right to go there. In fact, this is the King who comes from that and on his authority sends us to that. Those are marching orders. So, when we look at Jesus as Messianic King, he comes to a broken world. For it, from it, all of it. We see that he comes to fulfill the Old Covenant. Matthew, more than any of the other Gospels, will take Old Testament allusions and draw the line to Jesus, sometimes in ways that we don't even totally make sense of. Most of the time, pretty cool. So I won't say he won't always sometimes confuse us, but he's really stressing to the point where he hammers it almost excessively. This Old Testament points to Jesus. This finds its fulfillment in Jesus. Jesus is what it was talking about. So we read Jesus in light of the Old Testament. You don't skip the Old Testament, just jump into the Gospels. Matthew would say no, because Matthew makes no sense without that. But we want to see how he is satisfying, fulfilling, and completing it. And so we're going to have to talk Old Testament at several junctures as we walk through Matthew and see how the heart and meaning of it is revealed in Jesus. And as I said at the end, the sevens point to him coming to the completion of Israel's story. And what we're going to see is that Jesus is coming to build a kind of people. God made humanity to be his people and to live with them. In our own sin, Adam threw that away, and we've walked in that sin. God calls out Abraham to make a people. That people always falls short of that standard over and over, and the genealogy highlights that, right? They wind up going into captivity because of their idolatry. The people of God become people of Baal and Asherah and Moloch. When are we going to see God's people? Humanity was made to be God's people. Israel was a picture of God's desire to restore and call to himself a people. That was what he said at Mount Sinai. I'm going to do something with you that I've done with no other people. You will be my people. I will be your God. And they were like, yeah, whatever. Attention span is so short. And so, great promise, but we're longing for the delivery. And if Jesus is the completion of Israel's story, then we expect the revelation of the people of God through Jesus. That's why his kingdom has to come through discipleship, is we got to make a people. Finally get that people. And so it's going to birth this community, that the kingdom comes in the rebirth of a new humanity through Jesus. So, takeaways then. What do we do with all this? It has implications. What does Jesus mean to us? If Jesus' kingdom is for the broken, it's not earned, it's not deserved. You don't got to be good enough to be a part of Jesus' church. He came for the not good enough. You don't have to be good enough to be used by Jesus. He called nobodies, and we'll hit that in future chapters. But right here out the gate, when we want to get a vision for Jesus' kind of discipleship, it's not a we're the best. There is no application form where you show me all your character traits, and if you got more, that are higher than 3 than less than 3 on the 1 to 5 scale, that I take you. You get invited through the grace of God available in Jesus. And yes, you'll get transformed. We measure against Jesus. Are you knowing him? Are you being united to him? Are you becoming his people? So the vision and the standards are this grace invasion that comes in Jesus. It's not earned, it's not deserved. Whoever you are, the door is open. To come. What does Jesus mean to us? Jesus is the fulfillment of the law. And so there is a transformation that Matthew expects, and Matthew will reveal. The disciples on the other end of this book look almost nothing like the disciples at the beginning of this book. But the transformation isn't legalism. It isn't condemnation. Because Jesus, as the fulfillment of the covenant, takes the condemnation of the law and fulfills the legal demands of the law. And he doesn't call his disciples into that. He calls them to himself, to become like him. And the biggest indictment they get on the other side is that they remind people an awful lot of Jesus. So when we talk about transforming character, when we talk about growing in a discipleship that, helps you overcome sin and temptation, I believe that. But not because we've got these massive legal codes we throw at you, and not because we're guilting you at every corner, but because I think Jesus fulfills that and has victory over that. And that when you find relationship with him, when you are united with him, you find a heart that is different. You find a character that is different. And so you don't refrain from sin because there was a law. You refrain from sin because of Jesus, because of your deep love for him and union with him. So the discipleship of Jesus invites us into an intimacy, and the character change then is the character change of relationship and family likeness. And so when we talk about discipleship view of character, we just want to see, do you look like Jesus? Not did you get a good job and have you worked out your organizational skills and, does your dress code match whatever arbitrary dress code we made up at this time? Do you look like Jesus? And then if Jesus is the completion of Israel's story, is our community centered on the worship of God? We were made to worship and glorify him, to dwell in his garden and represent him to the world, to manage his world in his likeness. If Jesus He's making us his disciples. Then our community should have returned to worship of God as its center. What we do for him. What we do to his glory. How we interact, our fellowship, our joy, our friendship, our rejoicing, our potluck dinners, and our services, our hangouts during the week, and our prayer requests and phone calls are centered on the worship of God. That's who Jesus is revealed in his genealogy. That's the marching orders where Matthew's going to take us. So I'm going to throw up 2 questions and let you guys break into groups to discuss them. Yeah, we're okay. It's 5:55. I'll give you guys to about 6:15, so that's about 20 minutes. And the first question will just be, how can we show people that Christianity is for the broken instead of for the righteous in our daily living? I think people have this idea that when they get better, Christians might want them, and that's just not where we should be. Like, we want broken, messed up people. Not because we want them to stay that way, but we just think Christianity is for them. We have a track I wrote in the back, and it quotes, I think Shane Claiborne, he said, people say, the church is full of hypocrites. And he says, no, we're not full. There's always room for more. We're not saying we're perfect. We're saying we're sinners, covered by the grace of Jesus. And if you notice that we're sinning, that we're sinners, and that we're messed up, like, we weren't denying that. And guess what? You're messed up too. So you found your club. Come, find grace here. So how do we get... There is a stereotype, there is an impression. How do people meet the grace of God in us? Question 2, how can our church live out a community centered on the worship of God beyond the Sunday service? It's easy to talk about how we center it here, and we definitely must. But then what? Are we a community of 1 day a week centered on Jesus? So how do we become that kind of a community where the worship of God's the center beyond the Sunday service?